Calvinism has what I call a ignoring the shooter problem. Now, there are better analogies, but I'm going to stick to this one for now. Think about the analogy of a man who shoots someone, an innocent person, and we as jurors or detectives or police or what have you, we start looking at the cause of the death, and we find that a bullet pierced his body and the internal damage caused his death. And then we stop there and say, well, we figured it out. All the while, we're ignoring the fact that there had to be somebody shooting the bullet. Of course, it would be absurd to act in that way. But Calvinists theologically do this constantly. So Calvinists believe, according to their own words, Westminster Confession of Faith, for example, chapter 3, that God decrees from eternity past, unchangeably, all things, whatsoever comes to pass. Well, that certainly includes every act choice that man commits. Not only that, but every thought, motive, and purpose. Every thought that you think is determined by God, and you can think no other. It's not humanly possible to do other than, act other than, think other than, or be motivated by reasons other than what God has determined. And yet, God holds man responsible and culpable and condemns him and judges him and punishes him for it. So Calvinists give God all the credit for the good that he brings about in all that he determines, but they will give him no credit for the bad. It's inconsistent. If you're going to give him credit for the good, you got to give him credit for the bad in that theological framework that I just outlined for Calvinists. But what Calvinists often do is ignore the shooter. In other words, they will ignore that part of their theology where God unchangeably determines all things when you're pressing them on how man can be held responsible and culpable for all that he does. Let me give you a few examples, and we're going to talk about this. Here is John Piper talking about this very issue. John Piper is a leading theologian out there in our world, and he's a Calvinist.
Point number 2. All people are still responsible in that condition, accountable to God, liable to judgment, because this darkness that they are in, this slavery that holds them, has its power over them, not against their will or against their desires, but precisely because of their will and because of their desires, they love sin so much.
John Piper, a leading Calvinist, told us man is responsible for his slavery to sin and this darkness of sin that he's in because of his desires. But who determines your desires? So it's God is ultimately the one responsible in Calvinism. He gets the blame too. Just like David is held responsible and gets the blame for Uriah's death, not because he actually put his hands on Uriah and killed him, but because he set the things in motion and originated this evil. It was God that determined all the evil thoughts and motives and plans and purposes and acts. It's he that does it, and man can do no differently. Man has no control to do other than. And the bullet, just like the bullet, is not alive. It has no means to control itself or to disobey the gun or the trigger puller. Well, in theology, Calvinism's theology, unlike a bullet, man is alive, but he has, now listen, man in Calvinism's theology has as much power to act contrary to God's decree as a bullet does the physical laws that govern it. When man pulls the trigger, the bullet has no more power to disobey what has happened in the gun because of the man's finger than a person does in Calvinism's theology with God's decree. You have no more power to do differently, and yet Calvinists will not hold God responsible. But it doesn't work that way. You have to be aware of the shooter. Let's offer another example. Now, often you will hear Calvinists say, well, man is held responsible because he's acting on the desires of his heart or his nature. They believe that man is born with their words, God-hating nature. And he, because of this nature, because of the fall, he will hate God, want to disobey God, not want to be righteous. And he can do no other, of course. He's captive to this nature he has no control over in their theology. So he's doing what his nature dictates. He's captive to his nature, like a lion is going to eat meat. Why? Because his nature dictates that he will be a meat eater. He'll always choose meat over vegetables because of his nature, they will say. Okay, so once again, looking at the bullet, ignoring the shooter. Who determines their nature? So you got to blame God for that. It's logical. Well, here is two Reformed friends of mine, David Lewis and Jeremiah Nortier, talking about this very issue, about the human nature dictating what a person does. And I offer the question live, who determines the nature? See the response.
So here's how I would answer this question. Who determines your nature, AK? Adam.
I like it.
Adam determines your nature.
Adam, my friend David says, determines your nature. And by that he means because of Adam's original sin, all the human race was thereafter born with this fallen human nature. The Bible never says that, by the way. Genesis 3 says nothing about that change in the human nature. This is always presupposed throughout the Bible by religious people. But the reality is, it's still looking at the bullet. Fine, let's just say for the sake of argument that we have this God-hating nature we're born in because of Adam's sin. Who determined the fall? Who determined Adam and his sin? Who determined these things? You have to deal with the shooter. In fact, Jeremiah, knowing that I would ask the question, of course, ask it for me.
And he denies that.
But who determined Adam's nature?
Okay, well that's a legitimate question.
Valid question.
But we're post-fall. Sorry. We're post-fall. We can't go back. The fall has happened, okay?
So saying who determined Adam's nature, not exactly how I would have worded it, but the point is made by my friend Jeremiah, of course. But notice the response. First of all, it is acknowledged that it is a legitimate question. Well, of course it is. But then my friend David says, well, we're post-fall. In other words, we're going to ignore the shooter. We're past, the gun's already been fired. The bullet has already happened. So let's not deal with that. Let's not go back and deal with the shooter. Well, it doesn't work that way. You got to deal with the shooter. At least if you're going to convince anybody else of your theology, you're going to have to deal with the shooter. Especially when you concede that it's a legitimate question. Of course it is. It's like asking, well, who fired the bullet? Well, legitimate question, but it's already happened. The guy's already dead. I mean, the shot's already been fired. Well, but you still got to find who's responsible for that original shot, right? But this happens constantly. It's not only these kinds of answers. The fact that Calvinists will often grieve over the wickedness that happens around us, as they should, and rightfully so, but inconsistently. Every time they grieve over somebody doing something evil, you have to ask the question, well, who determined it? These people can do nothing but what they're determined to do. You have to blame God. That is the problem of your worldview. Now, nobody wants to blame God because we know God is innocent. We know God is not actually to be blamed. But on their theology, he is, logically. It's a chain of events. They'll often criticize us who are non-Calvinists for not understanding what they say or not agreeing with them or opposing their viewpoints. All the while, don't ignore the shooter. Who determined that we would not agree? You know, it's an amazing thing. Calvinists concede that you don't have to be a Calvinist to be a Christian. In fact, most people who call themselves Christians are not Calvinists. It's an amazing thing that who Calvinists concede are the body of Christ, the majority of Christians. God himself has determined that they, his own people, the majority of them, would not like or understand and just not like what he himself has done. He determines that they will not like and will not agree with, morally speaking, him determining them. Or perhaps not even, he will decree that and determine unchangeably that they would not even understand it. You know, oftentimes when we're talking to Calvinists about these things, they will cite the passage from Romans 9, which is misapplied, where Paul, dealing with an interlocutor, says, "Who are you, O man, to reply to God? Will the thing formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this?" They'll say that to us, but they're ignoring the shooter. Because any man that would reply to God in their theology is the man who's been determined to reply to God. The man who's speaking against his Creator is the man who God decided would speak against his Creator. So this is what Calvinists do. They kick the can down the road. They will not address the shooter. And oftentimes when this is said, like, well, who determined that? they'll somewhat get frustrated that we say it so much. Oh, I know what you're going to say. Who determined what this was going to happen or whatnot? But that is what you believe. So often it is that Calvinists will be saying, well, you just don't understand, or you just don't like God's sovereignty, they'll say. And then a non-Calvinist will respond, well, who determined, according to you, that I would not like God's sovereignty? And they'll get mad or accuse you of mocking them or something, or not taking it seriously. The reality is that is what they believe. What's wrong with saying it again and again and again, since it is their theology? My Calvinist friends, that is what you believe. So bringing it up so that you will face the shooter is not something we are to avoid. It's something you are to face. You got to deal with the shooter. You cannot avoid him. He's there. So in other words, you're going to have to deal with the fact that God is the one logically and morally responsible for all evil in your system. I know that you don't believe that he is, and that's a good thing, because you recognize the truth, which is that God is completely good and not responsible for evil. You're just inconsistent. And even if you don't believe that we understand or get it, Calvinists, especially compatibilists, act like and speak like it makes perfect sense to them. Well, it doesn't to the rest of us. And so you're going to have to deal with the shooter. You're going to have to look at the shooter and explain it to us.